And I know there's probably a lot of thoughts.
One thing that's really well done is I taken time out of an insane film.
What would go through your mind if you go into the family business and have a real hard conversation with your father, the founder of the business, and say, I can't keep doing business like this. I can't keep living like this. I'm going to have to leave. And before you even get out of the door, your father says, no, I'm going to leave. And by leave, I mean leave the business, leave your mother, leave you, because I've been living an alternate life for many years. That's what my guest on this episode of Unbeatable went through. You're going to hear Matt Lesser's incredible story and how he went spiraling downhill and then finally got the help that he needed. And now he's turned his life around. Matt's got a great story, and I can't wait for you to hear it on this episode of Unbeatable.
These stories of triumph over adversity will help you handle your toughest days in life and become unbeatable.
Hey, Matt, thanks for taking a little time out of an insanely busy holiday season to be with me on this episode of Unbeatable.
My pleasure, Jeff. I've been looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah. So holidays are just around the corner. You got a family. What's the favorite tradition? What's the thing that you're really looking forward to this year?
Oh man, I only get to pick one.
Well, okay, you can take two or three, but I just really want to know what's at the top of your list, man.
Honestly, the top of my list is we just love Christmas Eve is our favorite time together. It's just our family. My oldest is coming home this year, which is it's always touch and go. He's in the movie industry, and so he'll be here. And he got engaged 3 weeks ago.
What?
So
Congrats!
So we're on the verge of having our first daughter-in-law or any in-law for that matter join our family, and so. So we're especially excited this year to be together as a family. So I'd say Christmas Eve is the highlight for us. So from that perspective,
yeah, I think it is for our family too. Since it's just you guys on Christmas Eve, is there anything special that you do that day that every year Christmas Eve everybody knows we're going to do this thing?
Yeah, so we have a list of about 5 or 6, seems to be growing every year. It might be up to 8 now. I don't remember, of our favorite appetizers. And so we don't make a meal; we just make appetizers. And so everybody gets to pick one, and then we have a handful that we do every single year. And we have done that I did that growing up. And so I've done it most of my life, and we adopted that as a family when my wife and I got married, and we've carried it on to this day. And now the kids love it because sometimes literally that's the only time we will eat that particular food the entire year. So
I love the fact that you don't do a big, huge spread on Christmas Eve. Let's just keep it easy and do our favorite thing on Christmas Eve. That sounds awesome.
Yeah, we love it.
You already, so Matt, the only reason I'm asking you this question, you already answered the question that I was about to get to, and it was about growing up traditions. So, man, I want people to hear the story of what your childhood was like. I want people to hear the story about what it was like when you stepped into the family business with your father. But what we're going to camp on in just a few minutes is the earth-shattering revelation that you learned when you stepped into this world with your father. So let's just roll the tape back a little bit before you learned about your father having multiple families and kind of an entirely different life at the same time that he was, your father. So let's roll the tape back a little bit and talk about your childhood growing up. What was it like? Where'd you grow up? What was mom and dad like and family like?
Yeah, no, happy to. So, growing up, when I was born, my family was from Lake Forest, Illinois. My dad was a youth pastor, and he was going to seminary at the time. And so, so we moved from there to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, actually, when I was 2.
Where
Lived there
it's so much warmer than Illinois, right? Let's go up north, farther north.
Right. So lived there until I was 4, and then we moved to Northeast Indiana. And so I grew up, spent basically from 4 until I was, I think, 21, and grew up in a very small, I mean, we're talking 700 people. So everybody
All
knew
right.
everybody's business. It was
Yeah.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
Very small lake community. And so my childhood growing up was largely in and on the water. And so I loved it, you know, fishing, swimming, skiing. And then in the wintertime, we actually had, you know, real winter back then. We'd spend a lot of time on the ice during the wintertime. And so, I actually have very fond memories until I became a teenager. And when I hit my teenage years, my dad began traveling, actually a little before then, but he began traveling a lot and to Florida. He bought a business down there. And so it started out that, you know, it was a week a month, and then it was 2, and then it was 3, and then it was like every other month, and then it was every 2 months, and then it just that became our reality. And so my dad and I began to butt heads pretty seriously. And my youngest brother was born. Largely, it was not planned, and I became almost like dad. In fact, until he was probably 2, he called me dad. And he
Your
just
brother
didn't know.
called you dad because he saw more of you than he did his own father.
He did. Yeah. And I spent more time with him. I cared for him. I loved him, man. He's my little brother. And so he might have been 3. I don't know. But anyway, eventually he did he figured out that I'm not his dad, and my dad's his dad. And but it was a very it was a challenging time. And so I didn't know what was going on. I mean, we had some suspicions that things weren't right. I mean, obviously my mom and dad, their marriage was it was in a lot rougher shape than us kids knew. I mean, how could it not be when you're when you're gone that much?
When he's gone for 70-80% of the year? Yeah.
Yeah. And so but I didn't think much about it. I mean, I did, but I didn't. It was one of those things. I was busy in school. And so I spent a year going into my freshman year of high school. I got a very rare blood disease, and I wound up spending a year literally in the hospital. And so I had treatments, and they could keep me alive.
You spent an entire year of high school in the hospital?
Pretty much. Yep.
Wow.
I mean, it wasn't straight. I mean, I got to go home at times, but
back and forth.
It was
in and out of the hospital.
Back and forth. Yep.
Yeah.
And I was on full restriction, so I wasn't allowed to do sports. I mean, the thing that really was troubling to me was that I had growing up until about my 7th grade year, I was overweight. I was the kid who was always picked last in gym and all these things. And finally I decided, you know what? I want to be in shape. And so I lost the weight. I got in shape. In fact, I went from being the slowest kid on anything that I was in to one of the fastest. And here I was going to start varsity in soccer my freshman year because I'd gotten pretty good. And I couldn't even go to school. And so my freshman year, my mom actually homeschooled me, working with the school. The school is actually great to work with. And because I was getting treatments, and the treatments would make me extremely ill and blah. And it was just it was a very tough year. And during that year, my dad was actually around. And so it was almost like a family reunion kind of a thing. But then, and it was a very growing time for me. I spent the first 6 months of my illness, quite frankly, angry, because I'd worked my tail off and I felt like I was missing out, and I felt like it wasn't fair, and all those
varsity soccer team. Yeah, sure.
Yep. And then about halfway through, I had this, it was almost like an epiphany or a divine revelation. And I met God, and that changed the entire perspective of my illness from there forward. You know, people ask me, it literally was a middle of the night experience. And people ask me, it's like, well, were you healed that night? And I say, no, I was not physically healed, but my soul was healed and my heart was healed. And it changed my perspective from there forward. And when I was finally released, I was restored to health literally almost a year to the date from the time I was diagnosed. It was really interesting. And I could go back to life. And so, but during that time, like I said, it was interesting because my family was together, which we really hadn't been together much. But as soon as I was released, it almost immediately went back to the way it was. And so finished high school, I'll stop there. Anything you want to ask further about that before I move on?
So are you saying that when you got basically healthy and left the hospital, Dad bolted again and you didn't see him much after that? He's down in Florida. You and your mom and your little brother are living up in Indiana after you get out of the hospital. But while you're in the hospital and very unhealthy, Dad's around? Because that's just weird.
You got it.
Okay, I got to know a little bit more about this before we go on. Tell me what happened halfway through that year when you had an encounter with God.
Yeah, sure. So for the first 6 or 8 months, I would get a treatment literally weekly. The first part, it was more than that, but it went to weekly treatments. Oftentimes the cadence was treatment, up all night, terrible headache and vomiting. And then the next day it would start to subside, and I'd have about 5 good days before I did the whole thing over again.
It sounds like you're going through a chemo is what it sounds like.
It was chemo-like. It was not a chemo product. It was a blood product, but it was not chemo. But it did affect the consistency of my blood, which gave me terrible headaches. And so what we learned over time is I had to drink a bunch of water. Literally, I was drinking, if I drank 2 gallons of water during my treatment, I wouldn't get sick, but I was pee all the time. So that's a trade-off.
2 gallons of water. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a human camel that we're talking about.
Right. So anyway, it was my treatment day, and then that night, same routine, ill. So it was literally 2:30 in the morning, and I only know that because there was a clock on the wall opposite my bed. And so I'm climbing back into bed after I was in the restroom, and I literally had this thought, and the thought was this: Matt, here you are, angry at God, blaming him for this, and he's the one person that can actually heal you. What are you thinking? And so literally in that dark moment, I was alone that night. My family had gone home. Mom and Dad would often stay with me, but I was alone that night. And so
you
literally
were in the
I just said,
that night.
I was in the hospital.
Yeah.
And I literally said, God, I'm sorry. I've been angry at you, and you're the one person that can actually heal me outside of this, medication. And so I'm done. I'm done being angry. I'm done fighting. And I give my life to you, whatever that means. I wasn't sure what it all meant, quite frankly. I just prayed that prayer and I went to sleep. And from there forward, Jeff, my mindset about everything, I'm not going to say it flipped like a switch, but it changed dramatically. At that point, I realized, okay, you know what? There's a reason to this. I don't know what it is. I may never know, or I might not know for years or decades later. But there's a reason for this. I don't believe this is an accident.
Well, it's fascinating that you would say this, because I've lost count of the number of people that something like you're describing happened to them. They got really angry with God and they had some degree of faith. And this event, this health thing that you're talking about, was the reason they walked away from their faith completely and want nothing to do with it, even years or decades later. It's fascinating to me that your story is basically the opposite. In the middle of what would normally make people very mad at God, I didn't do anything to deserve this, air quotes. You realize, hey, God, I'm sorry, and here I am. I'm yours. And man, it's also incredible. It's actually beautiful, man, to hear about the difference that moment made, not just in your health, but in your future. So let's fast forward to Dad. When did you step into what is the family business? When do you step into the family business? When do you decide that that's where you're headed next?
So when we moved to Indiana, we moved here because my dad bought into an oil distributorship, and it was focused primarily on convenience stores, gasoline and diesel fuel, those kinds of oils. And so literally I from about the time I was 4 until I stepped in, I didn't know anything but, business ownership, and, it consumed our lives. And so, but that's all I knew. And so when I went to college, I didn't know anything different. I studied business because I wanted to. I thought that was my path. And so I did. So I was one of these weird kids. When I started college, I knew exactly what I wanted to study. I wanted 2 majors, 2 minors, and I knew exactly what they were. And I did not deviate the entire time. So
awesome.
Yeah. So I finished college. But I realized something my senior year. I realized, I don't want to work with Dad because it's not going to work. And because first of all, I'm not going to travel like he does. I'm not going to go back and forth because we had businesses in Indiana and Florida at the time. Now, Florida one was a little bit different. It was a separate ownership structure. And I can talk about that in a minute. But after I graduated, I needed a job. And so I worked for him. And so about a year later, a year and 2 months to be exact, I went in and said, Dad, this isn't working. And one of us needs to go. It's probably not going to be you because you own the stock. And so I'm leaving. And Jeff, I had planned to go to grad school, and I didn't know what I was going to study. I considered going into ministry, so I thought I'd go to seminary. My wife and I were just like, don't know where we're going to go here.
So wait a second. You were already married when you went into Dad in the family business, just you and Dad, and said, hey, this isn't working. One of the two of us has to go. And I already know how this thing is going to go down.
Yeah. At that point, my wife and I met actually in elementary school. We dated all through high school, all through college.
Wow.
And at this point, we had been married for 8 months.
So, needless to say, not just family relationship, family business stuff on the line, but you've got a family you've got your marriage to look out for and your own family to take care of when you walk into the office and say, Dad, one of those two has to go. And I guess it's going to be me.
Yep.
What brought it to a head? You described how often your dad was gone. You described, kind of some of the pressures at work, but what was it that actually brought it to a head and said, no, I ain't doing this?
I think that's a good question, Jeff. I've never been asked that. I think there was just there were probably 3 or 4 different catalysts that happened all at the same time. One was I wanted to do life differently than he did. I didn't want to live that life. Second was I felt a calling to something different. That I wanted to live life differently. I didn't know what that was, though. I didn't know if it was ministry or business or whatever. Third was we just didn't get along. We just did not see eye to eye on most of things in life. And so, literally even just a quick sidebar, for my bachelor party, he insisted he wanted to bring in strippers and the whole 9 yards. And I just said, Dad, if you do that, me and my friends, my entire wedding party will walk out because none of us are into that. None of us. And so he couldn't understand that for the life. It caused a huge fight between us to the point that I said, Dad, if you do that, we're leaving and you'll be there alone with them. So that's up to you what you want to do. And if you're going to do that, I'd rather you not even come. And so that's just one example. And so we had those kinds of headbutts a lot. My view of business was I wanted to grow it and see where we could go with it. His was, hey, if it makes money, you take all the money out and you spend it and you party. That wasn't the way I wanted to do business. And so all these things came to a head and I just had it. And so literally in that conversation, when I said that, he literally said to me, he said, sit down. Dad's a big guy, played football in college and deep voice. And so I sat down and he said, I'm leaving. And he meant it. And he divorced my mom and he moved to Florida. And on the way out the door, he signed the business over to me.
Yeah, hold on. When he said, I'm leaving, just for all of the listeners who are driving right now and missed that statement, what he meant was, I'm not leaving the business. I'm leaving everything behind. Explain that part one more time.
When he said he's leaving, he meant I'm leaving the business. I'm leaving your mom. I'm leaving you. I'm leaving your little brother. My middle brother went with him.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
When did you, okay, so this part blows my mind. In fact, as I was learning a little bit about you, Matt, I was sitting there reading this saying the amount of courage that it takes for you to walk in the door. I mean, there's plenty of sons that have issues with their dad and dads that have issues with their sons, and they kind of work through it. But the amount of courage that it takes to stand up to your father morally, to stand up to your father's business principles, to basically say, hey, if we're going to do business this way, I'm out. That takes great courage. But then to learn in the process that he's got an entire separate life that he's been living, that part blows me away. So would you explain that to the listeners for just a minute?
Sure. Sure. When he left, over the course of the next, let's just say 6 months, it was between 3 and 6 months, I began to uncover one thing after another. The first one that hit me was I had suppliers that threatened to that threatened to not supply anymore because they said we owed money. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I can't find anything that we owe you money. And so they began to send me invoices and statements. And I'm like, where did the money go? Because I showed it all paid in the system.
Sure.
Well, I found checks that were voided, and then he wrote
man.
personal checks. And so that led me to uncover. It's like, okay, where's all this money going? And so then that led me to, oh, wait, it's all going to Florida. It's like, okay, so what else is in Florida besides this business? Oh, we've got a mistress. Okay, great. Oh, and there's question about, one of the other kids that, is there, don't know. I won't even speculate because that's not right. I don't know for sure. But found out that there was actually two businesses. There was a yacht. There was house on the water. There was this, there was this. And it was a lifestyle that could not be maintained by our business because in a good year, the business would make maybe 300,000, but not to maintain that kind of lifestyle and maintain a family in a different state. And so basically all the money was siphoned out of the company in Indiana to try to maintain a lifestyle down there that was not sustainable.
How long, when you started digging, how long did you realize this had been going on?
Well, it's one of those things. The more I uncovered, it's you just keep digging and you find more and you find more and you find more.
The more you dig, the uglier it gets, right?
Uglier it got. Yeah, it was years. It was years.
So,
and by the time, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking, you started to describe 13 years old and dad leaves for a week out of the month, then 2 weeks a month, then 3 weeks a month, then a month at a time. And then pretty soon he's gone in Florida a whole lot more than he is back in Indiana. And I'm wondering at 13, 14, 15 years old, what's going on down in Florida. So I'm just trying to figure out for the audience right now, how old are you when you figure this part out? Because there's dad's lifestyle and his, he's erratic by the time you're 13. How old were you when you uncovered all this?
Well, I didn't uncover the depth of it until I was in the saddle of the business. And at that time I was 23, 24. That's when I began to under the depth. We had begun to question probably when I was in college. He and I had probably the last very honest conversation he and I had before the day I resigned. I was 18, sophomore in college. And, he said something to me, just he and I, and he said something to me about, well, I confronted him about how much time he was gone and blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, I did this for you kids and blah, blah, this and blah, blah, that. And finally I just said, you never gave me a choice, because had you given me a choice, I would have chosen to have a dad, not all the stuff that you've supplied.
That's a comment right now that I hope lots of parents who are working their fingers to the bone, trying to afford some nice Christmas gifts, heard reverberating off of you right now. Like, hey, the stuff is not what your child needs as much as you being around them, and working 80 hours a week just to provide the stuff is not making up for the time that you're not with them. So, man, this is, your story goes from bad to ugly, but now you've inherited a business that's basically, in shambles, and a father who just bolted on you and your mother and left for his alternate life down in Florida. And man, I can't help but think, Matt, at this point, most guys are going to declare bankruptcy. They're going to wash their hands of it. They're going to walk away from all of it. What do you do next?
So I unfortunately I kept uncovering, as you said, it went from bad to worse. So the next thing I uncovered were two of our properties had underground storage tanks that were leaking and polluting neighboring properties.
Oh,
so
my goodness.
The EPA gets a little grumpy about that.
I was going to say, the government likes to hear that, right? This is a very expensive fix.
Yeah, it is.
Money
and
that
so,
you don't have because you still owe suppliers.
Exactly. And so when they came basically saying, hey, you got to clean this up or we're going to shut you down, literally, I got to the point of saying, here's the keys, here's the deed, it's yours. I can't clean it up. I don't have any money. You can sue me all you want. You're not going to get a dime because I don't have anything. And they actually took them. So that settled that. But then the other one, the last one and the big one is that withholding tax wasn't paid for a year. And the IRS will have their money. And
yes,
and they don't care who's sitting in the chair.
Right? with interest and penalties too.
Yep. And they don't care who's sitting in the chair, and they don't care who did it. They don't care who did it. They just care who's sitting in the chair now.
Yeah.
And so when that one hit, literally I stopped sleeping. I began to experience acute anxiety, panic attacks. I didn't know any of this terminology. I didn't realize it, but I was spiraling into a deep depression. And to the point then, about 6 months into it, was the first time that I didn't get out of bed. And I didn't get out of bed for days. And I tried to, and then finally, I tried to fake being sick. I was newly married. I didn't know what it was to be a husband. I thought that to be a husband, because I didn't have a great example. And so I thought to be a husband, I had to be macho and protect my wife from all this stuff. And, my wife years later said that she knew that there were problems, but she felt like I was inside of a glass house. And she was on the outside looking in, so she could see the stress, she could see the anxiety, she could see that people were upset, but she couldn't hear anything. So she didn't know the details. And, and that illustration, honestly, I never forgot it. Obviously, I know it now, 20 some odd years later, because I realized that when she shared that, I realized I not only didn't serve her well, but I actually shut her out. And, and that could have really damaged our relationship it did damage our relationship. It took years of counseling for us to rebuild. And I'm so glad that we went through that experience. But yeah, it was tough, man. And it got to a point, the depression kept getting worse. And it got to a point then where I became suicidal.
And I want to point out at this point, none of this is your own doing. You inherited, and I'm using the word inherited literally and figuratively right now. Your father passed all of this on to you, and then bolted and left you with it. And now you're the one in the leader's seat, as you just said, and all of the pressure, or the phrase that I'd like to use, the burden of leadership is heavy on your shoulders. Sure, man.
Yes.
I can understand why you would say maybe it just would be easier. It would be quicker, let me put it this way, if I just ended it all.
Unfortunately, that was the thought. I didn't see any way out.
What changed? What stopped you from doing that? Because there are countless examples of guys in your situation that went through with it.
Honestly, the only thing I can answer to that, Jeff, is that God intervened in just miraculous ways. And, the first one was the day that I was going to do it. The night before, I actually slept. I hadn't slept at that point in months. I woke up and I actually went into my office. At that point, I hadn't been in my office. This now would have been, so I think I stopped getting out of bed just before Thanksgiving of 97. And I didn't go back into my office until March of 98. And so when I got into my office, so literally, we're floundering. I don't even know how the business somehow still maintained while I was out. I had hired my mom, and she was basically stuck trying to figure all this out while I was gone. She knew I was sick, but she didn't know what to do either. And so literally the day that I was going to do it, I went to my office. So like I said, first time I've been there in a long time, sat down at my desk, pulled out 3 pieces of paper. I was going to write a letter to my wife, my mom, and my youngest brother. And not one word ever got written, because I had this fleeting thought. Somehow I had a moment of lucidity. And I had this thought that when I was a kid, I knew my parents had taken out a life insurance policy on me. I knew nothing about it. So rather than calling the life insurance agent, who happened, and this is key, happened to be a lifelong friend of my mom's, I drove to his office 3 blocks away. Now, we still were in a small town, a little bigger than where I grew up, but a small town. I walk in his office. He happens to be there. I spend 15, maybe 20 minutes with him trying to see if there's any kind of a suicide clause. I don't remember ever using that phrase. I may have. I don't remember. I left. I drive back to my office 10 minutes away. I might have stopped for a coffee. I can't remember. And I walk in the door. My mom's right there. And she says, "Hey, let's go out for tea," which is something she and I would do just to get away. And we hadn't done it in a long time at this point. So I said, "Okay." And she said, "I'll drive." And which was weird, but I'm like, "Okay, fine, you drive." So we're driving toward our regular tea spot. And rather than going straight on this one particular street, she turned left. As we're turning, I said, "Well, where are we going?" And she said, "To see a friend." And it wasn't until literally years later that I found out that when I left my life insurance agent's office, he picked up the phone and he called
I
my
was
mom.
going to say, I think I know
And
how this is developing. Yep.
yep, he called my mom and he said, her name was Jean. She passed away in 2012, but he said, Jean, um, I know things are tough. I know that your husband left and you're dealing with all this crap, but he said, none of that matters right now because I just saw your son. And if you don't do something today, he will not be here tomorrow. And so she hung up the phone and she called the only other person that she could think of who went through something very similar to what I was going through, literally a decade prior. It was almost to the date a decade prior. It was kind of uncanny. She called him up. He happened to be in his office. He's now this very uber successful business person, very wealthy, very powerful in our area. And he literally said, bring him right over. He cleared his calendar. And as we're driving on this road, she turns into his office. Now, I grew up with his kids. My perception of him was that he was wealthy, powerful, and he scared the life out of me. And so as we're pulling in, because I didn't have I had a very bad perception of strong males. My dad was one, and now he was one. And so as I'm pulling into his office, I said, "Yeah, I'm not going in there." And my mom said, "That's okay. He thought you might say that, and he's willing to come sit in the car with us." So we spent 6 hours that afternoon in his office. At the end of that time, Jeff, he never said, "I'll take care of it." I mean, he literally could have stroked a check to cover all of our problems, and it would have been like pocket change for him. But he did say this. He said, "I will walk with you through this." And he faithfully did. He took me under his wing. First thing he did is he got me help, and I needed psychiatric care and medication bad. And so as I literally was taken away, and not voluntarily taken away, he called my wife and she came and she met with him and he basically laid out, okay, listen, there's a problem. It's much worse than you think it is. And so he actually met with her and then he literally took her to the place where I was. And then I was able to be reunited with her. But literally I was taken off the grid for 9 months.
Yeah. You were getting some inpatient care basically is what was happening.
Yep. Yep.
Man, the fact that this guy would clear his calendar for 6 hours on no notice to spend time with you itself is amazing. But then this tells you a lot about this kind of guy that he says, I'm going to walk with you and I'm going to walk with you all the way through it. And I'm not going to walk away from you, kind of like Dad did. Man,
Yeah.
that man that you're describing is incredible. Everybody needs a guy or a gal like that in their life.
Oh my. Yeah. To the point, Jeff, that years later when I sold the business, I went to work for that man.
Sure. Of course, if he's that kind of person, a human being, then you can expect he'll be the kind of boss that anybody would want to work for. I'd go work for a guy like that.
Absolutely.
Hey, can we talk about the burden of leadership? The phrase that your wife said to you was the glass house. And man, I've done a little bit of leading in my days. You have led and you've led business and led people. And now as a, kind of a speaker and, an author, you lead leaders. So I want to talk for just a second about the challenges, some of the struggles that go along with leadership. I think a lot of times people that have never stepped into a significant leadership role, they look at it from the outside and they say, oh, it would be cool to have all of that responsibility and all those people that are, listening to you. What they don't realize that comes along with leadership is a lot of pressure, a lot of demands. And I think your wife nailed it with this language of the glass house. So when I teach leadership now, I describe the burden of leadership. I call it a terrible privilege. I really do believe that it's an amazing privilege to be able to influence people and to make their life better. But there is something terrible about it when that kind of responsibility is on your shoulders. And what you stepped into in a leadership role was not just high demand, high pressure. I got bills to pay and no money to pay them, but I'm also following behind a father who's been living this alternate life. And, everything that I've seen growing up has not been a good example. So how did you where did you finally get to the point that you felt comfortable opening up to, your wife, opening up to your mom, opening up to this mentor of yours and saying, man, I can't do it alone. I need some help.
Yeah, great question. And it's Jeff. I love your terrible privilege way to describe it. I've often described it as it's one of life's greatest honors and one of life's greatest burdens to be in leadership, because you're responsible for other people. And so, I think for me, Jeff, it's the first 9 months literally was spent in just rebalancing the chemicals in my brain that were so out of whack. Getting to the point I could sleep again, getting to the point where I wasn't having panic attacks, and getting to the point where I didn't think the world was just crushing in on me. From that point forward, then we were with a counselor. My wife and I were with a counselor. The business restarted. And
okay, hold on for a second. You went to counseling
Yep.
separately, you and your wife, or you and your wife went to counseling together?
So for the first 9 months, I went alone. A lot of it was psychotherapy, helping me just deal with some of the basic issues,
Sure.
I guess. And then she joined me when we started to transition out of that. And then we were in counseling for 6 years, every week.
Right.
And
every week for 6 years. All right.
Every week for 6 years. Yep. It was the greatest investment we've ever made in our marriage. And I mean that sincerely. In fact, I never encourage people to go in any kind of debt, especially credit card debt. But I have told people, if your marriage is suffering, it's a whole lot cheaper for you to go into credit card debt than it is to go through a divorce. But it's worth it, quite frankly. I mean, but that helped us. I've often said that helped us restart without actually having to restart. And it was a huge blessing, unbelievable. But as I started to get healthier, probably past that year mark, is when I began to talk about with my wife, with my mom, with my little brother to some degree. He was very young at the time. What was going through my head, what was happening. And then it wasn't until years later that I told my story publicly. It was probably 10 years later before I told my story publicly. But as I entered back into the business, and I realized something really quickly. Number one, and I don't even, like I said, Jeff, I don't even know where this came from other than it must have just been divine, but I just knew it intuitively. I cannot, and I mean cannot, I cannot do this alone. I need to have people around me and be mentors, be influences, be voices in my life to help me. Because the one thing they don't teach you, two things they don't teach you in business school. One, they don't teach you how to handle a business that's failing, and they don't teach you how to scale a business. We started back over with 3 people that grew then to a little under 200 people by the time I sold it. And I didn't know about leadership. I didn't know how to lead people. Here I was, as the business began to grow, I had to hire people. I was 25, 26 years old, hiring people that were twice my age. And you can't lead somebody twice your age like you lead a peer or somebody younger than you.
That's right.
And so literally, I started reaching out to, I just made a list. I went through, okay, who are all the people I know in my life that are leaders in business and nonprofit, government, academia, you name it. I made a list. I had probably, I think, 40 or 50 people on this list. And I went one by one. I'd call them up. Can I buy you lunch? Can I buy you coffee? Can I buy you a beer? Can I buy you anything? I just want to spend an hour with you. 1 hour is all I ask. I didn't have any money. The business had just restarted. And so I said, I would have offered to pay for the time, but I said, please, can I just buy you lunch? And I'd ask them 3 questions. One, what is the number one lesson you've learned as a leader?
Down. Okay. I'm going to write these down. Number 1, lesson learned as a leader.
The key lesson you've learned as a leader. Number 2, what are the questions I need to be asking as a leader that I'm not asking? And then 3 is, what books should I be reading? And those were the key questions. I would often get, 10 lessons learned, not just 1. They'd often give me a whole list of questions that I need to be asking people, which I would then turn right around and ask them those questions. Because basically I'm like, tell me what questions. Okay, great. I'm going to ask you. And then they give me usually 1 to 3 books to read. And, you can see the bookshelf behind me. This is one of, I think, 10 bookshelves I have here in my office. I've read every one of those books. Most of them are on leadership. Now, some are fun books, but most of them are leadership, because I needed to know how to be a leader, because I didn't know. I just didn't know. My first foray into leadership and leading a business crashed and burned in a big time way. People lost their jobs because of that. And yes, to your point, it wasn't necessarily my fault, but I went down with that ship, and it hurt bad. And I didn't want to see that happen again. And I wanted to learn how to lead well. And I had to learn how to lead generationally above me and then eventually generationally below me. And that's challenging.
Yeah. I want to compliment you, man. The strongest leaders that I know, even some guys and gals that are just dripping wet with innate leadership talent. They were born with it. The strongest leaders that I know, like you, have this insatiable desire to learn more, to understand leadership better, and they never stop growing and they never stop getting better as a leader. So the fact that you were willing to take out that list, go sit down and start talking to people, and you're just basically taking a master's degree in leadership with conversations over coffee or over lunch is brilliant. But the strongest people that I know, almost every one of them have gone through pretty significant counseling, and it's because of the counseling that they are now much stronger. We've talked about counseling a lot on this show because we deal with people when they're at their worst moments in their life, and they'll describe how it was weeks or months or in some cases years of counseling that helped them get healthy, and now they're far stronger than they were before this, before the tragedy. And I kind of look at counseling for all of those big macho guys and gals out there that feel like I've got the world under control and I don't need any help as a leader. I don't need counseling as an individual. I want to tell them this is the guaranteed recipe for disaster. No one is strong enough to handle it all on their own. But secondly, counseling, in my opinion, is the same thing as putting a cast on a broken bone. Why wouldn't you get it healthy and make it stronger? And after the bone heals, it's often strongest at the spot where it was broken in the past because it's healed up stronger there than the rest of the bone. So for the guy or the gal that's listening right now, that's really wrestling with some things in life, don't be ashamed. Don't hesitate. Go get the help that you need. You will be better off after the fact. You'll thank God for it. Or to use Matt's words, the best investment that he's ever made in his marriage was the counseling that he did. You'll be better off in the long run for it. Matt, you started to learn a thing or two about leading, and then you started to help others learn a thing or two about leading. So describe for us Uniquely Normal and what it is and what you're doing with it.
No, I'd love to. I want to piggyback just briefly on what you just said. I don't know. I would love to give credit for this, but I don't know who said it. And shame on me for not knowing. But I heard this phrase about leaders just recently, and it goes something like this. Leaders who can't be questioned do questionable things. And that's why it is so very important. You know, I have been a big proponent of having mentors and having people that you're accountable to in life. And I have, most of my life, I have had accountability or a mentor or a counselor or all three at the same time. But there's been brief periods where I have had gaps. And in those gaps, I will tell you, I have suffered. I have made very questionable decisions because I don't have that wise counsel. You know, I'm a big believer that there's counsel there's wisdom in the counsel of many.
Yeah.
And so, so I love what you just said. And you know, one of the things I'll come back to your question, I promise. When I launched this business, I had just come out of, so when I sold the business, I spent 12 years then in private equity. That's where I really fell in love with equipping leaders, and many reasons why. Then I left and I really floundered for 2 years trying to figure out, okay, what am I going to do? I didn't exactly know where I was going to go. I just knew I was done in private equity for many reasons why. And so when I decided to launch this business, a dear friend, mentor of mine, he's 84 years old now, and he says he has dyslexia, so he's only 48, but whatever. And so, he called me up. He called me up and he said, "Hey, Matthew, like, let's meet for a beer." I'm like, "Okay." His name is Chuck. I said, "Okay, Chuck, let's do it." And so we met, and he says, "I understand you're starting a new business." And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Don't do it alone." And I said, "Okay." I'm bootstrapping this puppy, man. I don't have investors, I don't have the big, the big Silicon Valley, type cash flow or investor backing. So this is me, man. So I said, I can't afford to hire anybody. So what do you recommend? And he said, put together a board of advisors. He said, find 4 or 5 people that, 3 things. 1, you can trust. 2, love and care about you. And 3, will speak truth to you, even when, or especially when it hurts. And I said, okay. And so I asked 5 people. One of them is my wife. And I asked them, will you serve? Will you give me, will you invest in me a half a day a quarter? I can't pay you, but will you give me a half a day a quarter so that I can talk to you about personal and business and everything to a person? And this Chuck, my 84-year-old mentor, he said, now you'll be the first to serve, right? And he's, yeah, of course. So he's serving. To a person though, Jeff, they all said the same thing. If I agree to do this, there's nothing off limits. Nothing. We're going to talk to you about personal, business, your thought life, your marriage, your kids, how you spend your money. We're going to talk to you about everything. Like, it's the only way I'll do it. To a person, they all said the same thing. And Jeff, I will tell you that group of people, we've now been together for almost 2.5 years. That group of people has saved me from going off the rails more than once. They have not allowed me to quit. I've tried to quit 3 times. They won't let me do it. So you get down, man, you get frustrated. But having that group with me has been unbelievable. And so, you mentioned that your listeners are leaders. And so if your listeners can, benefit from that, that is, I recommend that now when I teach or I train or I speak, that's one of my favorite things to talk about, just because I've experienced firsthand the power of it. And so, so now to your question exactly, I became passionate about equipping leaders when I was in the trenches working with leaders. So one of my things that I did in private equity was I was given the honor actually of traveling around the world looking for business investments. And so when I was doing that, more often than not, I would have an opportunity to meet with the business owner, CEO, whatever. Oftentimes there are family businesses. And I began hearing this story, and I didn't hear it once or twice or 3 times. I heard it 100 times. And it was something like this. Very quickly, it was, I sacrificed everything to build this thing. And what this thing was, this business. And the sacrifice usually meant their marriage and their kids. I sacrificed everything to build this thing that I thought would give me satisfaction, purpose, meaning, and flexibility, income, whatever it is that they thought that they were after. Now, here they were. Most of them were in their 60s, and most of them were male. But so I did have some female, and I had some even younger. But they would often say, and usually it was with emotion and with tears either in their eyes or coming down their cheeks, here I am. I have everything I thought I wanted except for what I really wanted. And that is my marriage and my kids. Many of them were on their 2nd, 3rd marriages or divorced, or if they were married, they were living separate lives. Many of them were estranged from their kids, hadn't even met grandkids. And I kept hearing the same story over and over. And basically it was, I don't want this thing anymore. Buy it, take it. I'm done. And we did. We bought many of those businesses. And so, but in the back of mind, I'm like, okay, something's got to be done. Something has to be said. And that's what prompted me to write my first book, Unsatisfied, When Less is More, to tell that story, because I want leaders to stop sacrificing what is so near and dear, even though they may not know it at the time. Because when you get to the end of your life, it's true what they say, it doesn't matter how many zeros your checking account at the end of your life. What matters is your relationships that you still have. And so, so I became passionate about that. And then I also became passionate because I got to work in so many different businesses along the way. I saw the difference between healthy leadership and unhealthy leadership. And the difference it made in the people's lives inside those organizations. Because if you're an unhealthy leader, chances are you're going to create a toxic culture. If you have a toxic culture, you're going to have people they're basically traumatized. And I hated that. And then I saw an example of healthy leadership and how people thrived, and you could just see a totally different thing type happening, right? You just saw a different way of living. And it's like, okay, I need to capture that and train that. And I had an opportunity, when we built our business, we were very intentional about how we invest in our people, develop people. It's like, okay, we need to translate that, and we need to tell others do the same. So that's what I focus on now, is helping leaders intentionally build flourishing organizations where people can thrive and flourish themselves.
When you say you intentionally do help with that, how do you do that? What does Uniquely Normal do that helps leaders?
So a few things. One, we provide resources. So I've written 2 books. I just started writing the third. We'll see when that one gets done. Training and workshops and coaching, coming alongside leaders and their teams. I often, when I work with a team, I love to start with I'll find any way into the organization I can, but eventually I need to talk with the CEO, because if the CEO is not on board with building a culture, because if you want to build a healthy culture, it takes intentionality. You're going to have a culture regardless. So why not build the one you want? And so coming alongside the leader and his or her team and investing in them first. So helping them understand who they are. So you start with emotional intelligence. Who am I? What am I here for? What's my purpose? And in what's my identity? So we start with a lot of self-awareness, and then we move to others awareness. And then we move into things like, how do you engage in conflict in a healthy way? How do you intentionally develop people? So I talk about 3 pillars: empathy, empowerment, and excellence. And there's different workshops and different structures under each of those to help an organization become a flourishing organization where others can flourish along the way.
Matt, in graduation ceremonies all over the world, they have those students in the stands and the families in the surrounding the platform, and they're all telling everybody the same message for decades, or maybe even for centuries. And it's about how to be successful. You just used a word that doesn't get tossed around at graduation ceremonies. It actually doesn't get used in leadership circles as much as it should, and I really wish it would. You described a little bit of healthy leadership, and then you used the word flourishing. So I want to ask a question. Didn't have a chance to let you know about this at a time, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. The average commencement speech tells the students this is what successful looks like. But Uniquely Normal, your company is saying, let me tell you what a flourishing leader looks like. And those 2 things are not necessarily the same thing. So would you describe the difference between successful as a leader, air quotes, and flourishing as a leader? What's the difference in your vocabulary?
Happy to, because that was the key differentiator when I was writing my first book, between thriving and flourishing. Thriving is what our society says is success, where you are making money, that you have discretionary income, where you have title, you have position, you have power, flexibility, whatever you have, you have the American dream, so to speak, and you can afford that.
The American dream is killing. What I heard you say is, when you talk to leaders, the American dream was a nightmare when they finally achieved it.
Yep, exactly. Interestingly enough, I didn't mention this, but I had the same story told to me from businesses in Europe, and get this, Africa. So 2 places I didn't expect to hear it. Europe, maybe, but Africa, no way, but I did. So so thriving. The people I was talking to, man, they were thriving. By all intents and by all measure of societal standards, they were thriving. They had reached the pinnacle.
Success, basically, the success definition of success that you hear at the graduation ceremony, right?
Yep, exactly. And but yet they were absolutely miserable. They were broken people, and it did not have to be that way. And so the difference between that and flourishing is this. And I did an extensive word study on those 2 words. Thriving is a focus inward. It's a focus on me. It's a focus on accumulation of wealth, power, money, possessions, whatever it is you think that will bring you lasting satisfaction and fill this hole in our lives that we all have, to try to find purpose and meaning and why we're here. And so that's thriving. Flourishing is a focus out. It's a focus on something bigger than me. It's realizing that I'm here for more than just accumulation for me. So it's a recognition and an acting out of that recognition of, you know what, I've been given, I need to give. I've been invested in, I need to invest out. I have been blessed, I need to bless others. And it's realizing that I'm a part of a bigger narrative than just my life. And I need to take that into consideration and live my life intentionally. And that was the big differentiator for me, was the word intentional. That's why I keep using it, is because when I was talking to these other leaders, wonderful, wonderful people, don't get me wrong, I kept getting the sense of, how did I get here? How did this happen? Well, it's because you didn't stop at some point and intentionally think about what really matters to me. And then living aligned to those values and to those things that I say really matter to me in my life. And so, to your point, Jeff, if I was going to give a commencement ceremony speech, I would talk about pursue that which will bring you lasting satisfaction and deep joy and deep meaning, and guaranteed it will not be in money, because you can never have money enough. It will not be in power or possessions or a title, because all those things fade away.
It's fleeting.
It will
right?
be in
It's
relationships.
It's here for a moment and it's gone forever.
Gone. Right. And so that's the biggest difference, is understanding basically, who am I and what's my role in the greater narrative, and intentionally living my life in a way where when I get to the end, in fact, I use this illustration in my book, where I believe that, I don't know how it all works, but God in his sovereignty has somehow given us a pen, and we're writing the story of our life. And if you look at you analyze your story and you say, okay, if I continue to write my story the way I'm writing it, it's going to lead to a certain ending. Now, is that ending the ending that you want? If I'd asked more than one of these business leaders, at what point did you realize the story you were writing wasn't the story you wanted? And they're like, literally usually it was in the last year or two. And so by that point, it was too late. And so many times it was too late. So my challenge to people, in fact, it's an exercise in the back of the book, is take a look at your story. If you don't like the ending that you're writing, put a period down, turn the page, and start writing the story of your life that will have the ending that you so desire. And I'm telling you what, it's not, if you value your family, if you value your marriage, your kids, if you value having time with them, and you're working 80 or 100 hours a week so you can have a bigger bank account, those two don't align. That's just one example.
I had a chance to do a lot of cool stuff, see a lot of cool things, meet a lot of cool people while I was serving in the military. When I retired from the U.S.
so cool.
Army, I stood in front of some of my greatest friends and I said, of all the stuff that I've done, all the stuff that I've been, all the places that I've been, all the people that I've met, the thing that I am most proud about, and to this day, I meant every word of it. The thing that I am most proud about is that I'm still married to my high school sweetheart. I have a great relationship with all of our children, and it came at a great sacrifice, and I would make that sacrifice all over again. Because all of the junk that other people chased in the military, in business, in sports, you name it, they chase the accolades and all of the promotions and the rank and the power and the money and all of those things. When you get to the end of it, it's all worthless. It's literally meaningless. Yeah, you've got it all and it doesn't mean anything to you. So I stood before my friends and my closest, the people that are closest to me. And I said, the one thing that I take the greatest pride in is my relationship with my family. And it came at an incredible cost, and I would do it all over again, because that's really all that matters.
Wow.
I'm saying,
dude, I got
that
chills,
because,
man. That's awesome.
well, I'm saying that because I think you're talking to a lot of listeners right now as they're driving, they're watching this on YouTube, and they're asking the question, man, what am I really chasing after right now? Am I chasing after the next big promotion because I think that's going to make me happy? Am I chasing after a big pay raise? That way I could buy a bigger car that takes more money to insure and to drive. I can buy a bigger house, which is more work and it takes more money to take care of. Am I just chasing after bigger because I think that's going to fulfill me, and then become one of those many people that Matt talked to that get to the point that I got it all and I'm miserable, and none of it filled me up. None of it gave me what I thought it was going to give me. Maybe just a subtle but a huge shift in perspective is to decide what's really most important And then I'm going to start chasing after that. And I'm going to chase after something I'm going to chase after something that's going to leave me fulfilled for the rest of my life. Actually, I'm going to chase after something that's going to leave me fulfilled for eternity. That's what I'm going to chase after.
Yep. And that's ultimately how that hole in our soul is filled, right there.
Yeah.
Yep.
Matt, I could talk to you for 5 more hours about this, man, because what you just described a few minutes ago is exactly where my heart is, exactly where I hope all of the listeners to this podcast are headed. But unfortunately, I don't have that kind of time. And like we said at the beginning, it is the insanely busy holiday season right now. So before we wrap up, you've got some books out there. You've got a company that you started. There are people that have heard a little bit about you and they're thinking, I want to know more about Matt. So where can they find out more about you, man?
Website is a great place to start, www.uniquelynormal.com. And my email is matt, M-A-T-T, @uniquelynormal.com. So either way, my website talks about both of my books, and there's links to both Amazon and then directly to my publisher to get the second book in particular. But both are available there. And there's also more information about the business and what we do and those kinds of things. Love to engage with any of your listeners, Jeff. It'd be an honor.
We'll put links to your website. We'll remind everybody about your email address. It's very gracious of you to tell the audience about that. And for the listeners out there in the audience, like we normally do, we're going to give away a digital copy of one of Matt's books. I'll tell you at the end of this episode how you can get one free. Matt, thanks for being on this episode with me. But more than anything else, man, thank you for helping people figure out how they can beat depression, beat the pressures that go along with leading, and stop trying to succeed and start flourishing in life.
Amen. Thank you, Jeff. It's been an honor. Truly, it's been an honor.
Hey, I hope that Matt's words are echoing in your ear right now like they are mine. There are basically people out there all over the planet that are chasing success, and for them, success is all about me and about what I can get. And then there's some really satisfied people out there that are actually flourishing. And they're flourishing because they're living for more than what they can just get for themselves. Maybe this episode was a wake-up call for you. Stop chasing success and start actually being satisfied with your life. Start flourishing by pursuing something that's really going to satisfy you later on in life, or maybe even satisfy you for eternity. Thanks, Matt, for those powerful words during this frantic holiday season. You heard me talk about Matt's book, that we're going to give it away. Well, somebody who's part of the Unbeatable Army is going to get a free digital copy of Matt's book. And all you have to do to become part of the Unbeatable Army is just simply go over to unbeatablearmy.com. It's the email address it's the email list that we send people content. I send them articles throughout the week, more information about the guests, and it's totally free. So if you want to become part of the Unbeatable Army and maybe win a free copy of Matt's book, go over to unbeatablearmy.com. If you are just learning about this podcast for the first time and you like what you heard today, why don't you go ahead and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or subscribe to this on YouTube. And for those of you who are already subscribing and listening to these episodes, if you haven't already started doing it, why don't you follow us on social media? Search for @Unbeatable Podcast, and you're going to find Desiree Loudermilk there, who is our fan of the week this week. Desiree, thank you for being so engaged. Thank you for being part of some of the greatest audience on earth. I hope that Matt's episode has encouraged you, and I'll see you right back here next time. God bless.
These stories of triumph over adversity will help you handle your toughest days in life and become unbeatable.